Thank you, Bob. Our speaker today is Debbie Goodwin. She's returning after a wonderful lesson last week, and we're glad to have her back. Her topic today, when David prayed as a servant. And those of you who have a Bible, her scripture will be from 2 Samuel 7:18. Debbie, looking forward to it.
Well, before I start the lesson, I have follow-up work to do. Remember, there was a question that was asked last week that I did not have the answer to. Not sure I have a satisfying answer, but Louise wanted to know, and it is a good question, how much time had happened. Remember, last week we talked about the prayer of Moses as an interceding prayer. And wanted to know how much time had elapsed since the Red Sea and this event with the golden calf. Good question. So before I give you the best answer I found, I want to remind you the chronology that had happened between those 2 points, which I probably should have reviewed. They'd crossed the desert as the beginning part of their wilderness walk. As soon as they got to Mara, they complained because they were thirsty and there was no water, remember? So God provided water at their complaint. And the next day, where did they end up? At an oasis. What's the lesson? Wait for God. Okay? God provided manna for a huge number of Israelites. I found different numbers. I don't know how many, but there were a bunch. More than any desert could have provided food for. The only way they were surviving is by manna. Of course, the people complained. It was just the same old thing. And yet, they never went hungry. God provides. Then there was another water problem at Rephidim. That's when Moses got angry at the people and took it out on the rock. And he paid dearly for that burst of anger. And yet people still got water. There was an Amalekite attack. That was the time when they had to keep Moses' arms lifted. Remember that story? And who won? Of course, the people of Israelites. They won because God was their protector. And then there was Mount Sinai. What are they learning? Well, the best answer I got was that trip that I've just talked about took about 48 days. That's what I found out. I'm not sure that's what it was, but I looked at several timelines and one said 42 and one said 48. So somebody with more archaeological history than I have will have to give you a better answer. But what's the bottom line? God had been, again, directing them about what they should be doing. Were they learning? No. But I don't think we can point any fingers. That's the problem. We understand why they had trouble waiting, don't we? Well, the story today has to do with David. We know a little bit more about David, perhaps, than maybe any other Old Testament character. So what do you know about David?
Slingshot.
Slingshot. He was a giant killer. Yes. Male. He's a shepherd. He was a shepherd boy. Small. Musical. He was a harpist and a poet. I like the fact that he was a poet. Youngest kid in the family. Yep. Yeah, he made a couple of mistakes, maybe more than a couple. Oh, he on full display. Okay, we'll pass by that one really quick. He was a military hero. Yes, we know about the story of Bathsheba that included the murder of Uriah. And yet he was still included in the family tree of Jesus. Gives us all hope. So, it's quite a bio and an unbelievable summary of God's patience and commitment to keeping his word. which is one of the themes of the prayer that we're going to look at today. It comes after Saul has died. Remember, 1 Samuel pretty much tells the story of Saul and his kingship. And in the very last chapter, Saul takes his own life. I'm not going to go into all that story, but he takes his own life. And so Saul's kingdom is over. Second Samuel then starts with the story of David. And David begins his kingship with a lament for his king that he still gave honor to, and his best friend, Jonathan, Saul's son. And then again, chronology here is probably something to just keep in mind. So after he is crowned king, one of the first things he wants to do is bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, because the Ark is about 9 miles west of Jerusalem, but it is not being taken care of. It is the place of all of the holy symbols of everything that God has been doing and wanting these people to know, and they're just treating it like, whatever. So David makes a big deal about bringing it back. And then there was also a war with the Philistines at the very beginning of his reign, and David overcomes the biggest enemy of the day and wins the war. And so his kingdom is set. There's a war between the house of Saul and the house of David. People don't like their king being dethroned, and so they're going to find some other way to put somebody else on, and there's a big fight. I sometimes wonder if that maybe is what David is wondering about. What have I gotten my family into? But he is thinking about all of these things. He's happy about bringing the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, and he's seeing the Ark and think, we need a permanent structure to go around this place, a place where people can know they're meeting with God, something that's permanent for him, and show our love and respect for God. And so he begins thinking about how he can build a great temple to God. And then prophet Nathan bursts his bubble, comes in and says, no, that's not what God has for you. He has something for you, but it's not the temple. Now, I'm going to save all of the details. Some of you already know, I realize that, but I'm going to save some of those details until we get into the prayer. But when David hears what Nathan has given him, good news and bad news, okay, both, what does he do first? And that's what we find in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, verse 18. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord. I kind of see, I picture him kind of wandering maybe, or making a beeline toward their worship place and just sitting there, stunned. Maybe stunned in a good way, some, maybe stunned in a bad way, but just, And I'm wondering, maybe that's one thing that we could add to our prayer times. Just come before the Lord, just to sit there. Maybe he has something to say about what we're thinking before we even say it. There's a thought. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, any number of seconds before you start speaking might be a good practice. Anyway, that's what David did. He just sat there. But he continues by identifying to whom he speaks. David says, in following up that first line, who am I, O sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? David addressed Jehovah God as sovereign Lord. If you're an underliner or a digital highlighter, however you do it, You might want to think about underlining the number of times David addresses his Lord as sovereign, because it's important. There's another phrase he uses I'll identify in just a little bit. So what does this title mean? Well, it means one who has supreme authority. Okay. We do some dishonor to that by the way we place that toward God. And I'm going to talk about that just a moment. Supreme authority, yes. Let's leave it there for right now. The one who has the first and the last word about everything. So whatever it is you're praying, do we ask, what's your first word and what's your last word? Are you trying to get the last word in? It's a thought. He's the one who knows all. And here's the most important message I have to say to you about God's sovereignty. He's the one who knows everything and uses all of that knowledge to bring about his divine purpose into our lives. Does that sound like something bad? I am very uncomfortable with any definition that makes God a dictator who does what he wants, no matter how it affects us. And to assign to our sovereign Lord some kind of discompassionate action just because he can do it is to reduce God to someone he is not. So if you pray to that kind of God, all I can say is good luck, because that's not who I know. As a loving, all-compassionate God who works a plan that is for me, not against me. But this is where I find my biggest growth happening in trying to act on what I believe is my sovereign God. This is where I am called to trust my sovereign Lord with anything I do not understand. And there's a lot I haven't understood. And to trust that whatever it is that I don't understand, he is still working a greater plan I want to be a part of. So I'm not sure I want to direct all of his plans to what I want, because I don't want to miss the bigger plan he's working. David will continue to address God this way many more times in his prayer, so pay attention to it. Then he addresses his sovereign Lord the way a servant would address his master. And what does he say that truly describes him as a servant? He says, "Who am I?" I think sometimes I tell God who I am. You need to do this because. No, who am I? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? There's a thought. I mean, I could stop my prayer right then and begin to make a list. Oh my goodness, you're right, God. You did this for my family back. And then you did this, and then and I ran out of fingers. And it makes me think differently about what it is I'm still waiting for or wondering about. Who am I? And what is my family that you brought me this far? David's not talking about the future promise here completely, as much as he's talking about the past promises already kept. He's talking about God's favor that he does not deserve. And he became king from the least tribe, the youngest in the family. I mean, that just wasn't anything anybody ever thought of. He continues in verse 9, and as if this weren't enough, he says, in your sight, O sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. There's another phrase he says over and over again in his prayers. I'm your servant. This is not one king talking to another king. This is a servant talking to his master, talking to the one who's in charge, talking to his employer, so to speak. I mean, you don't talk to your employer the way you talk to your neighbor. There's a respect. There's a, he has the last word. I don't want him to have the last word on me right now, today. He talked to God as a servant. He's talking about about God's favor that he doesn't deserve. And he continues. David repeats the way he wants to be identified to God over and over again. And he says, your servant, your servant, your servant. It is a humble attitude, but it is not a manufactured one. It's one that comes from his heart. Do you sense his servant spirit in it? He's someone that has been blown away by the trust God has given him, that he would promise something unbelievably great to him. And David doesn't know how to respond. He says, what more can David say to you in verse 20? For you know your servant, O sovereign Lord. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. In other words, David understands there's a bigger plan here that I didn't see. And you're working me into your plan. Oh my, who am I that you would do that for me? What is it that Nathan said to him that is making him come to this place of prayer? Well, we find out about it earlier in the chapter in the last part of verse 11 and 12 is the only part of it that I'm going to read. And Nathan said to David, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you. This is after he said, you're not going to build a temple, but he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. Now you tell me, is there anything better to hear from God than to know that after you are gone, life will go well for your children and your grandchildren?
Even to the point of being crucified on the cross.
Well, that was God's son. Yes, absolutely. Being crucified on the cross. Absolutely. But think of it in your own context. That's a pretty major announcement, especially after it is still recent in David's mind how the family and followers of Saul fought against David's followers. And the whole group of them of Saul were killed. And he didn't want that to happen to his family. Of course he didn't. Based on what you've heard from David this far, do you see are you getting his attitude before God? He is grateful beyond words. He is humbled, sitting still, ready to what's next. He's respectful, he's worshipful, he's amazed. And what follows next is simply the response of someone who understands who he's talking to. And he says it in his prayer. How great you are, in verse 22. How great you are, O sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have all heard with our own ears. And who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth that God went out to redeem as a people for himself and to make a great name for himself and perform great and awesome wonders by driving out nations and their gods before your people, whom you redeemed from Egypt. You have established your people, Israel, as your very own forever, and you, O Lord, have become their God. He calls God great. He calls God a redeemer. He calls him a miracle worker. He calls him a military victor. And he serves that God. There's no one on his team he can say that about. There's no one in his family he can say that about. There's no one in the political structure he can say that about. But he can come before his God and know him as a redeemer, as no one else like him, as only one God, in humble gratitude for what God is doing in his life. So what happens when we pray as a servant to God's plan, whatever it is, even when we don't know what it is? As the best plan we can have on earth, then we are open to what God wants in a situation, and our eyes are more attuned to what he might be doing that I need to get on board. Instead of working in what I'm going to call, for want of a better word, a more adversarial relationship in prayer. God, why aren't you doing this? Why can't this be better? Why don't you do this or this or this or this or this? And plead with God to work our plan. We cry out of our hurt. We cry out of our grief. But to whom do we cry? We cry to the sovereign God who is working a greater purpose and includes us in it, even when we don't see it. What happens if we don't pray like a servant, especially when the issues are big and life-changing? We have a tendency to substitute our own wills and wants. And God is very patient with us when we do that. He is very patient with us. He does not close the door on us. The door is always open, and he always listens. Now David addresses sovereign Lord as promise keeper of all promise keepers. David trusts God's impeccable record here. There's no situation in which he cannot keep his promise, no matter how bad things get. But some of his promises take time. That's where we become more like the people at the base of Mount Sinai and do our own thing while we wait for God to do the thing we want. Right? I say that with humility because I've been there. He's never been late on a promise. But we all also know he's never been very early either. Oh my. Let's read what David says about it. And now in verse, where am I? In verse, the bottom of 24, 25, something like that. And now, O Lord God, I am your servant. Do as you've promised concerning me and my family. Confirm it as a promise that will last forever. And may your name be honored forever, so that everyone will say, the Lord of heaven's armies is God over Israel, and may the house of your servant David continue before you forever. I mean, we are the ones who see that prayer answered. Do you get that? David didn't. We look at the history that came from David's family and royal line, and we have Jesus. We see how God was a promise-keeping God. Doesn't that give you a lift in your spirits to come to God, not to get your will, but to be more confident that he has a more perfect will than you could ever think of? So why don't I ask for his will? But I think this prayer also shows his humanity. for he respectfully asks that God keep his promise to him and his family. This is interesting to me. This is just Debbie speaking here. This is what I see. You don't have to agree with it. But he asks for confirmation. Okay? But he doesn't ask for proof. And he doesn't ask for a sign. I see a difference there. You may not, but I do. He asked for confirmation. Let me make sure of what I've heard. Confirm it to me. He doesn't ask for signs that certain things will happen. He doesn't set up an obstacle course for God to overcome. Sometimes I think we've got all these obstacle courses in our prayer. Well, if this happens and this happens and this happens and this, then I'll know for sure the door is open. Well, I don't think it has to be that complicated, though it is never simple. David adds to his prayer in verse 27, again as servant of the sovereign Lord, and again addresses him as, "O Lord of heaven's armies." Now, let me just stop there. It took me a long time to understand that when they sang the song about, the God of heaven's armies, that came straight out of the Psalms. And when I found that out, I was so excited because it gave me a picture every time I would think of that understanding of who God was, the God of heaven's armies. We're worried about earthly armies today. We think about them a lot with the news reports coming on. Now, how much do we think about God's heavenly armies? I think I have more confidence in them than I do in these. And that's more of where I want to direct my prayers. Oh, Lord of heaven's armies, God of Israel, I have been bold enough to pray this prayer to you because you have revealed all of this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you, a dynasty of kings. Now's where we need to stop and remember. But that's not what David wanted to do, was it? He really wanted to build a temple for God. Now, have you ever had one of these big grand plans? I know this is a good plan. And if God can just get behind this plan and get me all the people and get it out, oh my goodness, it's going to be so good. And I start planning and making my lists and organizing and doesn't work. This falls flat. Well, I kind of think David, at least in his mind, had started building that temple. And as soon as we start I'm going to use the term as a metaphor. As soon as we start building our temple, our emotional strings start wrapping around it. And the more layers we put on that temple, the more emotional arms we put around that idea. And when God says no, it's like we almost have a hissy fit. How could you not know that this was a good plan? But David doesn't do that. David hears, and I don't think he just shrugged it off. I don't think he said, okay, I thought it was a good idea, but maybe not. I think it was more, And he walks into the worship place to meet with God and just sits there for a moment. And then he decides to get on board with whatever God is doing. It takes courage and servant submission to bow to another plan. But are we servants of the sovereign Lord or servants of our life plan? I'm talking big picture. I'm not saying you have to ask God, do I need to do laundry today? Because I'll always hear no. I don't know how David turned this corner. I don't know if it was in this prayer, if it was in the walk, if it was while he was sitting, I don't know. But I do know that the prayer says he wants God's name to be made great in the keeping of God's promise to David. I would think he would be thinking, okay, if God is going to give me a long reign, I can do this and 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 this, and I'll be remembered forever. But that's not what he's wanting. He's wanting God's name to be greater than David's name. That's servanthood with a capital S. I have met this place not with as much grace as David. Now, I'll never forget the period of time. I go back to my stories with Lisa because I learned so much from God about a journey for life at living with her disabilities, so many things that didn't work, so many doctors that didn't understand and didn't have any answers. So I came to a place, we were getting close to her graduation, and after graduation, you know, you get lots of support in the educational system. And then, howie, you're on your own, almost. That's what it feels like. So I was trying to get all the ducks in order so we could have, you know, life after graduation, and nothing was working. I mean, nothing was working. The medicines that she was on weren't working. The physical therapy she was taking wasn't working. The special education that was supposed to be so perfectly fitted by her plan for her needs wasn't working. And I was trying to fill in all the gaps, doing all my research, trying to do this and this and this and this and this and this and this, because I've got to prop everything else up because nobody else is doing it. And my plans weren't working. Nothing was working. Lisa was in probably a very bad time of depression because she also could feel that nothing was working. I will never forget the day that all of that just really crumbled in on me with all of its failure. And I realized that the best I could do, and I was doing my best, no one would have said otherwise, was not enough to give Lisa the life I wished she could have and knew she deserved. Now, that is a painful place for any parent. But in the vacuum, God came close and reminded me, no, you aren't enough, but I am. I am. And so I began to think about how I would cooperate with God's plan instead of making it for him. It was a new journey for me. And do you know what I found? That on the other side of all the no's I was carrying from all of these other things I tried, I began to see yeses from God. You see, once his plan is operating, it's yeses. Yes to this because it's his plan. Yes to this because it's his plan. It's not no. I fight against my no's to get my yes. But if I submit to God's plan, I get his yes. Now, that's still not a happy, skipping, let's all be happy kind of a journey always. Still can be a very subdued, quiet, wondering, don't know how this is going to work kind of a journey. But there is a different settledness inside that I did not have when I was pushing my plans and my ideas. A few examples that, or at least one that was really major for me. It happened a lot later than this incident happened. So it took time for God's plan to take hold and begin. But I began to see where God was healing Lisa's emotions and Lisa's awareness of herself. And I didn't have anything to do with it. I mean, this was God and Lisa working together, and now Mom could just watch. And then when we left the church in Centralia where she was living with us and had moved into an apartment supported with caregivers, and we moved to Portland, she said, we gave her an opportunity to make a choice about moving with us or staying. And she says, well, it's kind of like going to college, except this time you're going away. So we could, it was a safe way to make an experiment, and it worked. The experiment worked until it didn't several years later, but it worked for a long time. And the most beautiful thing happened when we weren't even on the scene. The place where she worked was an orthopedic clinic. We had two of the surgeons in our church. They had actually carved out a job for her and would always say, we are the better for it because of the energy she added to their clientele. A couple of the girls invited her to a Bible study. Now, she had been invited to parties when she was 4, when she was 5, when she was a cute little girl. But when she grew up and wasn't the same as everybody else, couldn't do the same things, couldn't walk the same way, couldn't wear the same clothes, couldn't do that. I don't remember her ever getting an invitation anywhere. And I don't say that as a smite. I understand adolescent minds and teen minds. I mean, I get all of that. I understand that, but it hurt. So when these girls invited her, it was a major day. One of the girls made it possible for Lisa to go to the Emmaus retreat. She could never have gone on her own. The girl was a physical therapist. She kind of understood Lisa and how to keep her on her meds and how to keep her rested and how to watch for the signs when she was getting overloaded. She was a safe person to be her sponsor. And I will say that was another yes from God, because Lisa came back truly changed about some major issues in her own psyche that God healed. I say all of that to say, when we pray a prayer that cooperates with God's plan, we will see results. I believe it with all my heart. Now, I'm not trying to turn it on its end and say, if we don't see results, it must not be God's plan. I'm not comfortable to say that, because God's plans sometimes take so long, we give up on them before we start seeing the ways they're supposed to work. So I won't say that, but I just know that stuff happens when we are working by God's plan. I'm not talking about miracles. I'm talking about turnings. I'm talking about returnings, talking about growth. I'm talking about a settledness that comes when I don't have the answers, but all I know is that someone does. And that's where I'm giving my attention. One writer put it this way: prayer is the energy that keeps us on the path toward the future so that we can see God's plans. Well, David ends his prayer the way we usually end our prayers, saying one more time the one thing we want more than anything else. He ends his prayer with a doxology, which is a good way to end a prayer. You know, instead of saying, well, are you going to do it? Can I have a sign? Is there something I'm supposed to know? rather than ending with a question, end with an exclamation point, because you know who God is. And this is who David knew God to be in 28. For you are God, O sovereign Lord. Your words are truth, and you have promised these good things to your servant. And now may it please you to bless the house of your servant, so that it may continue forever before you. For you have spoken. And when you grant a blessing to your servant, it is an eternal blessing. So, God's message to David is a no and a yes. But he said yes to he said his biggest yes to something David didn't even know to ask for. Do you see that? That's the plans I've gotten from God, the things I didn't even know to ask for. A continuing royal line that would help people know his sovereign Lord and hopefully teach them to be servants too. So here are some bottom line takeaways, okay? God is our sovereign, great planner above all planners, able to bring about everything he promises. If we believe that, something more settled comes to our hearts than there was before, when I'm left to my own plans only and getting God to agree with me. Number two, our sovereign God is working his plans into a bigger divine purpose that often is hard to impossible to see. But here is where we learn trust. It's the biggest place to learn it. It's the hardest place to learn it, but it is the best lesson to learn. Number three, we have an opportunity. No, we have the privilege to participate in a bigger plan than we can see, dream, or make happen. And number four, when we accept God's no, we will be able to hear and accept his bigger yes. I believe that with all my heart. And I would like to ask all of you to prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. So in closing, do you have any questions? I have a couple of minutes. I could answer some questions. Please, no timeline questions. And I'm not saying that just to, I'm not a history buff, so. Yes.
Could you go over accepting God's no?
Accepting God's no? Well, I mean, when I began to realize that my plans aren't working, because in our lives, if we set a plan in motion, usually we can see something about whether it's working or not. We know how to evaluate our plans. Am I right there? Okay. So if it's not working, I need a new plan. But if I continue to only put in front of a no plan work, my plan, and that plan doesn't work, and my plan doesn't work, and that's an exercise in futility. I prefer looking at my plan, which I did in Lisa's life, and realizing I'm working hard. I am, but it's not working. And in my frustration, I went to God and said, okay, what's the plan here? And you can look at scriptures. If you're uncomfortable in believing that God could give you a message that would tell you to wait, or I still have a plan for you, or something. But there are scriptures also that bear this same truth out, that it's his plan. We can't manipulate his plan. We can only obey it. When I try to give him my plan, does he obey my plan? I mean, that doesn't even sound good. So I want his plan. But to hear and know takes a servant who believes God speaks to me. When I ask him if I'm going in the right direction, he will tell me. And if I'm not there yet, then wherever it is you need to start to get there, start, because God knows where you are anyway. And he's going to intersect with you at any point. Mark.
Yeah, example of what you say in a different way is that he asked that if he could build God a house, a temple. God said, no, but I'm gonna build you a house.
It's true.
A house of wisdom, a house of a family that will continue forever. So he asked to give God something and God said no, but God said, I'm gonna give you something that you didn't even think about. But in accepting the no, he was able to see the yes.
There are a lot of no's from God in our lives that are really hard to take. And I am not bypassing or making light of that and saying in a moment you can turn a corner. I have taken weeks, I've taken years in some issues of life to turn the corner God was trying to get me to turn. He'll work with you where you are, not where you're not. So don't try to pretend you're here and you're really here. You know, he works with you where you are. If you don't understand, work with God there. That's the best advice I can give anybody. Another question or comment?
I just have a question or an observation. How do you evaluate whether a difficulty is God's no or something that's a challenge for you to continue to work? Do we stop every time something becomes difficult?
No.
But how do we interpret when, somebody told
Yeah.
me once, well, if you feel settled and at peace about it. However,
Yeah.
as a child of God, my children would be settled and at peace when I gave them the candy they wanted. And that was not my will in their life. But for a time, there was a settlement and a peace.
Yeah.
And I've had challenges sometimes where I have wondered, Lord, do I just need to keep at it? Or is this a no?
Okay, I can only give you my personal experience in dealing with this. I completely believe that God will always give me what I need to know anytime I ask, what I need to know to do his will. Okay. If I've asked a question and I get no answer, a really astute mentor of mine in my young adult years said this: if you keep asking God if this is the right thing and you feel like you get no answer, she suggested two things. One, you're asking the wrong question. Do I have the right attitude? Do I have the right people? Do I have is this the right time? It may be the wrong question. So look at that and keep asking, because if you keep asking the same question and get no answer, I just have always I follow that, and so what is the question? And then sometimes it takes me a few days to ruminate on that and figure it out. The other one is, it's not the right time for the answer. It's simple as that. That maybe you're not doing anything wrong. It's just not the right time. I'm asking God some questions right now about some issues and not getting a clear answer. So I'm either asking the wrong question or it's not the right time. And so I keep saying to him, okay, if you're not giving me an answer right now, I'm going to keep going the way I'm going unless you interrupt me. And I listen for his interruptions. I listen with scripture, with situations coming together, with wise counsel in my ear that always comes from Mark. I laugh, but it's, you know, I need counsel on some things. So, that's where I leave that. Is that okay? We want it to be 1, 2, 3, got the answer. And I just don't think it's that way. I think it's a process. Okay, I want to close with a prayer, and I have done something I don't usually do, but I am going to pray a version of David's prayer for us. Okay? Oh, sovereign Lord, who are we that you have brought us this far? For you alone are our God, and there is no one like you that we can go to. You always keep your promises to your servants, but we have not always understood the greater reason for your promise-keeping record. You want us to be a part of a billboard for the world, don't you? A billboard that all the world will come to know you as sovereign God above all sovereigns and perfect promise keeper in all situations. We confess some of your no's have been really hard words to hear. We confess that we have not always looked for your greater yes to follow. Forgive us and awaken us to the possibilities you know wait, that we may fill our days as your servants, cooperating with what you want and plan, and living in the ever-present awareness that nothing touches us you will not use for good. So with all the love we can muster as we contemplate how good and great you are, we are your servants. And all the people said, Amen.